scale of the damage to civilian infrastructure, and so therefore on the capacity to serve and help civilian populations and rebuild, in access to populations, and also the challenge around new technologies. Now, we have a strong panel of people who we've invited here today and an excellent group of guests, so I hope that we'll have time to have a good conversation. Our panelists are going to help us think about these challenges at first, but I think importantly about what we can do. So I want to just introduce the panelists very quickly. I'll then pose a couple of questions to them as a group to kind of get us started, and then we'll have a question and answer session where I hope we can bring in a few of you as well. And so at that point, if you just hold up your hands and we'll get you in. So our first speaker, we've got Zurab El-Zorav, who is the Chief of Learning, Leadership, and Management at the UN Secretariat. Hila Nawa Alam, the Director of Humanitarian Relief at Uplift Afghanistan Fund. We have Malake El-Terk, the Programs Director of Peace, Stability, and Security at Expertise France. Philippe Stoll, who's working on partnerships and engagement on digital transformation and data at the Red Cross. Bogdan Ivanel, who is the President of Commit Global. So if I could ask Zurab to start us off. Now, you are thinking nowadays intensively about protecting civilians in UN peacekeeping operations, and so I wanted you to help us help set the stage for us a bit. What are some of the key challenges and solutions when you think about your work in 21st century peacekeeping?
Thank you very much, Matt. In the United Nations, we still have 12 peacekeeping missions in different parts of the world, but primarily in Africa, but also in Middle East, Asia, Europe, and South America. And at least 8 of those missions, they have protection of civilians as their core mandate, because they are deployed to countries where civilians continue to bear the brunt of wars and conflicts. When the physical violence against civilians is either imminent or in progress, the missions have the responsibility to act to the full, and they do so along the 3 main tiers of protection of civilians action. One, through dialogue and engagement with the size of the conflict on protection of civilians. Second, the physical protection of civilians. And the third, creating an environment conducive for protection of civilians. When it comes to protection of civilians on the ground, we do provide physical protection. We do engage with the government and rebel movements. We do conduct the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration activities. But what and this works. But what the emphasis should probably be moved to is prevention of conflicts and violence, rather than responding to what has already happened. In other words, it's easier. It's better to prevent conflicts from happening rather than responding to what has already happened. And in that way, we could have less victims and less people displaced, killed, and less damage caused on the country. Secondly, I think more efforts need to be placed on addressing the root causes of conflicts. If your activities are addressing the consequences of violent conflicts but are not addressing the root causes, then it's going to be very difficult to achieve a longer-term sustainable solution for the people of concern. For example, the land ownership issue in some countries have become a serious impediment for return of displaced population to their areas of origin, because their lands have been either sold or given to others or resold, confiscated, etc. So making the return nearly impossible or with a potential of conflict and violence. So again, if we want to resolve this issue, we need to look at into the roots of those conflicts. And thirdly, some regions have the presence of law enforcement enforcing structures in less than 50 or 70% of the territory, like in Darfur. Protection of civilians is primarily responsibility of the government. But if the government doesn't have presence in remote, isolated areas, that means they won't be able to protect their citizens. So I think more assistance need to be provided to the to the host governments for strengthening the rule of law and security institutions, establishing police presence, prosecutors' offices, prisons, so that to provide protection and address impunity. Protection of civilians is a very complex issue. There are so many areas, starting from proliferation of arms, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, primacy of politics, but I believe those three aspects could be brought forward. Thank you, man.
No, it's an important list. Protection, of course, prevention is easier said than done, and the challenge, as you say, is that oftentimes the root causes then continue to fester and deepen, in fact. And when you talk about the need to work with government, I want to bring in both Hila and then Malake to tell us a little bit about the context they're working in. These are both Afghanistan, Lebanon, where either the state isn't capable of taking on some of these, call it services or protecting the population, or doesn't want to do it or can't be worked with actually for political reasons. So if I could ask Hila first and then Malake to comment on how this plays out in your arenas.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, and I really want to actually come in right there, as you said that if the government is not able to provide that protection, or even in the case of Afghanistan, where the government is maybe also causing violations of human rights, either causing or deliberately creating an environment of impunity to violators of any types of human or women rights or rights of minorities. So I think we are in a very, very particular situation right now in Afghanistan. Not that it was easy in the past 20 years before, as I think everybody who's ever been involved or at least opened the news sometimes knows. But what we have right now is very particular. So it's also, we had this little talk about it before in the smaller group, and I think it's difficult also to many areas. I think it's very difficult to really speak, and nobody really has a solution. And I think also the UN didn't have a solution anymore at some point, and nobody. The US, of course, left, and its allies. And so what happened last year in August in Afghanistan was really like a halt of everything, while everything being deprived of its funding, while people were already, COVID, multi-crisis, right? COVID, drought, conflict, protracted conflict. So obviously an emergency of really unprecedented levels in Afghanistan at that time. And so where we are now, 1 year after, I think from our perspective as a small now humanitarian organization that is, however, very aware of what the bigger ones are doing, what the authorities are doing, is that we're at a stage of like really totally fragmented aid all over the place. The lack of a trusted counterpart government, a very politicized aid. It's being abused, it's being used. There's this, of course, big topic of girls' education that is being held hostage. But it's also a huge leverage, I think, for the local authorities or the Taliban, which, as difficult as again, it's being abused. And I think donors really have to look into that really, really carefully, not to be fooled. As education doesn't mean education. As an example, also just here, we're not talking enough about how they have changed already school curricula, for example. So it's always these big girls' education, but do you actually look at what they're training our boys in already? It's not normal education anymore. It's not math and science. It's something else. And that had happened in the past. We've seen that already years and decades ago, and we're seeing this again. And it's really, really frustrating. It's heartbreaking for all peace-loving Afghans, the majority of all Afghans. I actually forgot what the question was, Matt. Sorry, I was just going off.
Well, I think what we wanted you to do was set the context, which you've done, and I think talk a little bit about what actually are the entry points where you are able to work in a situation like that of high fragmentation, etc.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So the challenges are, the list is very long, and I think many could be just Googled. And we know of the sanctions, we know of the collapse of the banking sector, we know of also the war again against women and minorities and so forth. So it's difficult, but there's opportunities as well, and there's ways to work. And I mean, the UN, of course, also has its presence there. The Afghans themselves are there. The goal is not to empty the country of its own people and evacuate everybody into foreign countries, but to help them on the ground. So what we, as a small now humanitarian organization, US-based, are doing is we are working solely with the most grassroots of organizations on the ground that are there, that have the access, that have the expertise, that have the skills. We're facing difficulties as well as US-based organization. I mean, there is these sanctions, so there is, problem of getting money into the country that also the UN and others are facing. I mean, I think the UN also, it was really, I know, with the money basically coming in bags of cash, there has to be a solution. There has to be something that is actually sustainable. How we are at this point where there's hawala, there's things that are regulated in Afghanistan that are working. We still believe very strongly that what has to be done on the smaller side of organizations, but also the bigger, is to really have to reach a more midterm and long-term approach and development, not only dropping food on Afghanistan again, but really giving it a chance to kind of, at least for people to survive. For us, what we do is we work again with grassroots organizations. We vet them very, very thoroughly because we have to. There's SDN check, there's OFAC sanctions. We have to prove and record that nobody ever in that organization has any involvement with these sanctioned groups or individuals. Of course, then we have to get the money in. But then I really have to say, once this is said. Our partners, they know how to navigate. If people are local enough, they know how to navigate their own. Afghans have solutions for their own problems. They always had, right? You just have to give them the means, or at least not take it away from them. And so that's what we really do. And maybe I end there. And I think everybody who's worked kind of on or in Afghanistan knows we're kind of trying to work with the mechanisms that were already established over the past 20 years in the national bigger programs, National Solidarity Program, Citizens Charter. People who know Afghanistan know of the community development councils, non-governmental, democratically elected. There was also criticism, they're not all functioning well, but otherwise now they would say it's still more than 20,000 over the country that are actually working. And so we are also working with our partners through these community development councils that are actually really helping us, even getting something like education for girls running, which we do and support as an example. So again, I was a bit all over the place, I think, but thank you.
No, that's great, Hila. Thank you. I mean, as an organization that works a lot in Afghanistan, I can just reiterate how much space there is to work at the local level on issues with and through communities. You've put a couple of other challenges into the mix. Sanctions is one, and the effect that has on civilian populations and on getting aid into countries, which we might come back to a little bit. Maleke, could you tell us a little bit about what you've seen in Lebanon and how the situation is both similar and perhaps different?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Hila, and thank you, everybody. So yeah, in Lebanon, situation is different than Afghanistan. Every situation is, of course, different. And what I can say is, the last 2 years in Lebanon was quite of a ride. We had a multiple level of crisis, a free fall of the economy, a blast, and now we had the COVID, and now we have the cholera pandemic. So the context has been quite complicated. The country was fragile before, with an influx of Syrian refugees that created a bit of instabilities, and a lot of aid as well came into the country to support the Syrian refugees for the last 10 years almost. I just think of what you said on prevention. Yes, we would love to do that in Lebanon. Moreover, for now, nobody really knows what's going to happen. We are more in a firefighting mode than trying to think, a bit ahead. The state is failing completely. So what's happening is we are implementing a project named Shabake that's supporting strongly the civil society and the NGOs in Lebanon. And they are the one addressing the needs on the ground. They are the one knowing the needs, the people, their community, and we are just supporting them to the maximum we can for addressing all types of vulnerability that are increasing by the day. Every type of vulnerabilities. The data are coming of like extreme poverty, job, there is no more economy, health system completely failing. So what we see as well is like we need to help them because they are the frontliner. They are the first helping everybody. I mean, we saw it after the blast in 2020, and because unfortunately the state is not having any capacities or possibilities, or is lost into politics, if I may say, and is not really able to address the needs of their population. So we are trying to continue to support them. We will continue to support them to foster the localization of aid in Lebanon and to give them all the means they need to continue to address the vulnerability that are, again, increasing by the day. They cannot, unfortunately, they cannot absorb everything. I mean, there is no state, so it's a bit complicated, but we are keeping the effort strong for the civil society to continue to address those needs, wondering and quid on the sustainability as well. Yes, the AFD is supporting the civil society, fostering the localization of aids. We have a project for the next 3 years and plus. And we know the civil society, the Lebanese NGO, will be the one remaining, and the international will be leaving at some point. So we need to find a way, even if we can't really prevent what's going to happen, because we don't have a crystal ball for the moment in Lebanon. Everything can happen. We can try to mitigate the impact of the current crisis that is like falling by the day and needs increasing by the day, and think of a certain sustainability of the aid. So we try to put them in the front line and in front of the donors to show them, to make them more visible, for at least having a bit of possibility of continuity of funding eventually, keeping in mind that funding as well is another question. 10 years plus of regional complex crisis, and with refugees, with different countries in crisis as well, funding is going to decrease a little bit. We know there is a shift as well with the Ukraine war, etc. So we wish to give them everything to the maximum for them to be, sustainable, visible, and strong for the future, because they're going to continue to be there. And the crisis, at least in Lebanon, unless I don't know what's going to happen, but it's not going to be stopping or improving tomorrow. Thank you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, so we started the conversation talking about what you might think of as some sort of classic post-conflict issues in terms of addressing root causes, addressing fragmentation, addressing failed states, if you will, trying to build state systems. These other two are also, unfortunately, relatively classic problems when you do have failed states and you need to find what can you do to shore up those states. And so this issue of localization, I mean, if you think about new solutions that are needed for assistance in the 21st century, the localization agenda has never been more important. We can discuss later whether or not it's being implemented appropriately or aggressively enough or not. But clearly that's one of the things that comes out if we think about what needs to change and what can change and work in the 21st century. But we also have a whole new set of challenges that didn't necessarily exist in the 20th century, say, and have really come to the fore in the past 10, 15 years. And that's around the use of digital technologies, the use of technology, information technology in and around conflicts. And this is where Philippe and Bogdan have, I think, some interesting things to say. So there are both new challenges, but also some new needs and new opportunities. So Philippe, if you could start first, and then we'll ask Bogdan to say a bit.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone, for joining this very interesting discussion. When it comes to the impact of digitalization on armed conflict, there is, for us, three elements that it affects the whole environment, the whole ecosystem. First is, as you mentioned at the beginning, Matt, the way wars are now fought. So we still have the classic kinetic way of fighting conflict, but we bring on top of that a new technological dimension with what we can see in some places, such as cyber attacks, use of autonomous weapon system, for example, which are very much driven by data, by technologies that rely on machines much more than human beings. We see also that humanitarian organizations such as the ICRC using also these technologies to respond more fastly, more efficiently, etc., to the needs that people are expressing. Some of these needs are even themselves technological. We see in some places people prefer to receive cash on their mobile phone rather than in cash, in kind, which is also helping them to be more secure, etc. Or when ourselves, we are sometimes potentially pushed also by donors to use certain technology, we see the rapid growth of the use of biometric technologies for registration, for example. So this is the second part, humanitarian organization, the way war are fought. And the last one is the people themselves using these technologies to reconnect with their family, to get the right information, to know what's going on. So all that is something we can see and has an impact on also protection issues, because these needs and these behavior creates potentially new vulnerabilities. I will give you 2 or 3 examples which are not a comprehensive vision, and we are still in the learning phase. But we could see the growing impact of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Nothing new, again, in conflict settings, but the speed, the span of these, and misinformation or information operations are so big that it impacts people. And it is about the way people take a decision that put their life at risk based on something which is wrong. And here I can have an example of a colleague of mine. I was deployed to Ukraine in March and April. He was in Mariupol and he was telling me a story. He was in a basement, in a shelter. They received information that there was a ceasefire. One of the person of his house went out, was shot at. Luckily, nothing happened to him. But it happened that this was kind of a fake information circulating so that the people will go out of that. And, it was interesting that the person was telling me that without making the link between misinformation, disinformation, and an intentional desire to create a wrong behavior. And this is, I think, one of the challenge that I will wrap up with, but how do we identify these new protection issues? We have the question of data protection, and I think the ICRC was an unfortunate example at the beginning of the year where we were subject of a hack, and we know how much it impacts people. It's information that are pretty private, that have contain information about their life, their behavior, their their beliefs, their religion, etc., and that can put themselves in danger. So both on one side, the data we collect as humanitarian organization, but also themselves, when they use these tools, the data they produce and that are hosted somewhere, we don't know who have access to it. And this is, again, we don't know to which extent there is a surveillance element, and the people are themselves putting in a new type of protection risk. Another element is the cyber attacks. We still lack to see when and if there is an attack against maybe a civilian infrastructure, how it impacts the population. There is a shortage or a cut of electricity, to which extent someone will face a big issue because of that, to which extent it's really linked, or is it a side effect? And I think all these elements, for me, makes it very difficult to make cases. And that's the new challenge that we need to bring and collectively, I think, as organizations, to try to make it as a concrete case. We always see the link between a shelling and humanitarian consequences. What is the link between a cyber attack or data leak and a humanitarian situation? So for us, the multi-stakeholder approach is something we think is interesting, and we try to bring together around the table the people who are in the decision making, so policy people, lawmakers, at the multilateral level. So the ICRC is trying to push for a stronger data protection of humanitarian data that are collected. We try to come with some policies about the use of certain technologies, standard, etc. And we also try, and this is something which is pretty new, where we are used to speak to armed groups, to governments, but we need to speak also with the tech giants, the producer, the creators of these technologies, to find solutions also that match with extreme contexts that are conflicts. So that's a bit that.
Very interesting. So you could think of it as a proliferation of solutions on the one hand, and also a proliferation of vulnerabilities on the other, which has vastly increased along with the kind of targeting of civilians and all the rest. Bogdan, tell us, how has this played out in your context? Your group has been working very intensively in Ukraine. Tell us a bit what this looks like from where you sit.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky that I'm speaking after all of the other great speakers today. And I'm going to zoom out a bit and look at the solutions as well. It's clear, as Hila said, that we're, and everybody around the table knows that we're in a multi-crisis environment. They're all happening at the same time. They're all creating new vulnerable populations, and they're increasing the numbers that you were saying in the beginning. And now more than ever, we need capacity for those that work for social good, be it civil society organization, be it UN agencies, or governments when they're on the right side of things. And we need this capacity really fast. We can't wait 5 more years or 10 more years. We need it yesterday. And technology, when built, opened, and in the open, when designed well from the beginning and aware of the circumstances on the ground, and when deployed timely and responsible, can really save lives and can fill this gap. They can fill this gap of capacity for many of organizations like the ones around the table here. And this is exactly what we're trying to do at Commit Global by consolidating, building, and deploying technology for social good in this type of circumstances, and making sure the organizations on the ground, the CSOs, big and small, and all UN agencies and government agencies have the technology necessary to support the people that need that kind of support. In the past 9 months, most of our work was focused on Ukraine, building the digital infrastructure around humanitarian assistance. So starting with access to information, support for civil society organizations, so internal tools so they might work better, do volunteer management better, do finance management better so they can focus on the needs on the ground. Aid management. So we're supporting UNHCR, we're supporting OIM, and we're supporting governments in Eastern Europe do aid management better through critical digital solutions that we build and we're maintaining. Access to healthcare, we all know, but we haven't spoken today yet about the fact that many people can't be refugees whenever they want because they're chronically ill. They can't just take their luggage and cross the border whenever they need. So right now we're operating 3 systems, one for HIV patients, one for cancer patients, one for multiple sclerosis patients coming out of Ukraine, connecting them with the NGOs and the health workers on the ground that can take over those cases. We just put out a women's health center focused on Romania, Bulgaria, and Moldova, which is kind of the safe haven now as a woman crossing the border from Ukraine. We're focusing also access to education, access to jobs, access to psychological help. A big problem coming out of Ukraine right now is the lack of professionals able to offer psychological assistance in Ukrainian. Many of them do speak Russian. More and more of them refuse to speak Russian when they're speaking to a psychologist because they connect that language with the aggressor. with people that want to hurt them. And we do have a huge lack of mental health professionals speaking Ukrainian inside European Union where we need them now. And we have a legal issue as well. On top of that, the fact that their jobs are not recognized in the European Union right now. So if a Ukrainian psychologist crosses the border, they can't do their job even assisting their fellow countrymen on the other side. So we're trying to build up the digital infrastructure so we can bypass these gaps. We're working with Veteran Affairs in the US who have a lot of experience with PTSD cases coming in. We're working with organizations on the ground to offer this kind of support. I would end by saying, because it was raised, that there is as much funding going around. Ukraine had also the effect of, drowning funding from other places that need it right now, from other crises around the world. And there are not many things that we can share. There's not a lot of infrastructure that can work both in Lebanon, in Poland now / Ukraine, or in Ethiopia. But technology can be a shared resource. And if we don't start using it as a shared resource now, cutting costs in doing this and making it more efficient, it's going to be harder and harder to respond to this crisis. I remember the head of the UNHCR when we presented the work, and he said, I wish we had this back in Lebanon. Now we have this infrastructure. Let's deploy it wherever we need it.
Thank you, Bogdan. It's very interesting to bring this back on the table because we started talking about the multi-crisis, but in fact, sometimes we're talking about the chronic crisis and crises that just keep going and going. And so even though we've moved on to the next one, as Maleke says, the previous ones are still going and still there. There's actually, I think it's quite interesting the way that the comments that the two of you have made around digital technology, new tools, links to some of the things we were talking about earlier. I mean, if you think about what are new ways to protect civilians in the 21st century, which is what is our assignment for today, is to think about that. It does seem to me that finding ways to help build civilian resilience in the face of these crises, whether it's through digital tools, empowering them through cash, working through local organizations, but focusing more on how to empower those individuals in these situations versus maybe a kind of classic post-conflict systems building, camp building, that sort of thing, really is something that is significantly different now than it was maybe 30 years ago. With that, let me open up to, we have about 8 minutes left. There's not a lot of time, but if you would like to say something, do what she has just done, and your name is Farah, has just done, which is put it up like that, and we'll get you in. Please, Farah.
Hi, everyone. Bonjour. I'm Farah. I'm the partnership manager for Save the Children France. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you so much. It was very insightful. Allow me to bring to this table those we haven't heard of, that is children. They make up to 50% of the population in humanitarian crisis. They don't have voice to the chapter because they're underage, obviously, so I think it's very important. A few words, keywords, because I realize we don't have that much time. I'll start by saying that we also have a compliance crisis. We talk about innovative solutions, but we already have a human rights framework that is existing and that we can use to keep those who violate child rights, but in general human rights, accountable for. We do have Safe School Declaration, Paris Principle. They've shown results, positive results, impact. So it's also, and you've mentioned it for Afghanistan, about impunity, so fighting against this impunity and speaking out as member states who are in position to do so. I would also remind, and we talked about data, collecting data to understand the protection needs, and this is where technology can play a role, but it's very important that we provide and invest in a broad sense of it, not just funding, right? I would also flag the need to also do integrated programming, but I will finish with that, but because we talked about sustainability, long-term results, you talked about resilience. Children will be the future of those societies, so it's shifting the power. We hear it a lot. It means providing, supporting for leadership in humanitarian settings. It's about mentorships. It's about trusting those organizations, giving them access to funding, including through pooled funding, because we have administrative barriers that exist. These are very quote-unquote simple solutions that can be used but are necessary, and please do engage with children between 0 and 18. Easier with the oldest, obviously. We can do that. SAVE does it in Thailand. You provide the support to NGOs that work with children. You talked about empowerment. If you have those citizens early on to understand the situation and support their country, I can tell you this is where you have prevention of conflicts. Thank you very much.
Great. I think we've got time for 2 more and, 3 more. We'll get 3 in. We've got 5 minutes. So who was first? We'll do it this, Woknesh, and then Cyprian, and then Meredith, and then we'll stop.
Thank you so much, Matt. My name is Woknesh Makonnen. I'm from UNOPS, United Nations Office for Project Services. It's a pleasure to be here, and indeed extremely engaging and interesting topic that we have raised. I just don't want to dwell too much in terms of all the important points have been raised already. In what the civilians are facing, the compounded vulnerability they're facing, not to mention the climate change on top of the conflict and on top of everything. So really, honestly, it's about time for us. Obviously, we can't deny the transformation technology brought in terms of reaching out, trying to address the issues in a much more advanced manner, like what Felipe was saying earlier. But in the meantime, I think one of the things that we need to really think is that we always end up using old tactics for new problems. What I'm trying to say is, for example, for any situation, we don't take time to think of the civilians as a center. Human-centered approach is missing. We just jump into sanctions. We do all sorts of the old tactics we use in conflict situations. That is, it continues to further marginalize and make the vulnerability of the civilians even much worse. So I think for us, while we're trying to appreciate what technology and what policy systems can really contribute to, equally it's important what kind of policy and political commitment that we need to have in place for us to deal differently for old problems or new problems with new solutions instead of using old tactics. So from that perspective, I think the issue of the need to use the civil societies, for us to really stand in solidarity to have a human-centered approach for conflict-affected areas, particularly focusing for the civilians that have been increasingly becoming vulnerable for the situation. So I just wanted to flag that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you very much. Cyprian Flies, I'm a teacher and researcher in Geneva at the Graduate Institute. I think, first of all, I agree with absolutely everything that's been said, and I think it's amazing in how such short comments, I think we've managed to say quite a few things already. And so I'll just add to it in terms of what is different in the 21st century compared to the 20th century. I think we've talked about it. We've talked about especially technology and also globalization when we talked about the root causes and so on. And I think so. Talking especially about technology and going back to a little bit of what Bogdan said as well as Philippe and Farah, I think another big part of it for me, so I'm an international lawyer, and I think reaffirming international law in this context is also critical. And I think not just to use the old tactics to solve new problems. I think there are new ways to reaffirm international law compared to what we used to do it, but I think it would be a mistake to believe that the international law we have well, I think in many ways it's good enough, but it's implemented enough. It's not, and it's actually under attack. And so I think there is two points I wanted to insist on. Is one of them is training and education, and I think we need to do a lot more in training and education, even though we are in firefighting mode. To go back to what Malake said, we need to include in the way we respond training and education of people involved on the ground. And in that respect, technology provides a lot of new tools to do so, to reach out to non-state actors, to reach out to fighters on the ground. And when you talk to fighters, people involved in armed conflict, I think a lot more of them than you would imagine are interested in learning more about the rules of armed conflict and so on. But again, I would insist on also the need to protect the frameworks we have in international law, because it is increasingly under attack from some countries, and some forces are not quite interested in joining the Western-centric approach to international affairs. So in the way of defending international law, in educating and training, we also need to approach in a pretty humble way and listen a lot more also to people in the global south, to beneficiaries, to civil society and so on, to eventually improve the enforcement of international law, because international law is IHL is what protects civilians in armed conflicts. So that's my international lawyer take on the question.
It's a good one, although it opens up a whole other set of questions, which are very interesting, and we need another hour. Last word to Meredith. We have 1 minute, 15 seconds.
Matt, it's okay. I talk fast, and I'll be very brief. There were just two things, and I think it picks up a little bit on your last point. I am concerned that we're accepting the premise of this new reality that 90% of casualties in conflicts are civilians, and that we're sort of saying, okay, that's there, and we have to respond to it, instead of saying we need to double down not only on international human rights law and human rights norms and treaties, but to say, what do we need to do that is new? How do we look at what is the Geneva Convention for the 21st century, and how do we look at that in a non-West versus the rest centric approach? I was listening to Martin Kamani, the Kenyan permanent representative to the United Nations, on a piece yesterday, and he was saying we need to put Africa at the center of these solutions and think about this in a completely different way. And I think too often we fall back into these old tropes. And so I think that's the first piece. The second thing, you've talked about local leadership and the ability for local leaders to often find the spaces for protection in all of this. And I think too often we say, yes, and we're supporting local leadership, but again, we need to take a really close look at how we are genuinely trying to decolonize our approaches and take a completely different look at really co-creating these on the ground, which means taking risks and dealing with OFAC and all of these challenges, but taking different kinds of risks to actually be led by the solutions on the ground. Thanks.
Perfect. Just, you timed it exactly right. So I'm not going to say any more. Thank you very much. It was a very rich discussion. I think these last 2 points are exactly in line. Although I also love this phrase, which I think sums it up perfectly, which is how do we become more human-centered humanitarians, if you will. So thank you very much for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you in the rest of the forum. Thanks.